Kelly, and I represent the Folk Art Society of Nova Scotia. There's a small group of us here who are determined to establish a folk art center here in Lunenburg, and we're working at it deliberately. I don't want to say daily, but it's front and center on a lot of our calendar of events. So it's to educate and inform the community and the province and the country at large with regard to the art form of folk art, and to elevate it up to be on a parallel, on an even footing with other art forms as are represented in our local museums and centers. But today is special. The Prairies moved to Lunenburg 10 years ago and haven't been back, they told me today. But truly, this is special because folk art is nationwide, is worldwide, and Tom has brought eye-opening examples, I know, for our pleasure, and also for his take from a craftsman's point of view and an artist's point of view, which Tom is in full flight. So without more ado, Tom, local resident, welcome. Tom McFall.
Thank you. You might want to say it for your applause until I'm finished, just in case. I've reworked this a couple of times to make it more interesting to Nova Scotians, and also to follow up on Adrian's presentation. And I'm going to show you some examples of the Germanic cultural spread diaspora across Western Canada, similarly to how it happened here, although a century later in the West. I'll get to that in a minute. There's a common perception that most of Western Canada is sort of devoid of culture, particularly of traditional culture. Of course it's not, because if you ever get a chance to see any of the rodeos in the West, you see how that particular part of old rural culture is still really popular. It's frequently sneered at even in Calgary, but it's popular nevertheless. And within those traditional cultures, going back, all the way back to the beginning of the 1900s and even earlier, and aside from the indigenous cultures, there were always folk art expressions of some sort. So for example, I grew up on my grandparents' cattle ranch in southeastern Alberta, and I remember every farm and ranch had whirligates there. And that was because you needed the whirligate before there were weather reports by radio. You needed the whirligate in order to know what the weather, what your day's work was going to be. So that kind of folk expression was incorporated into all of my childhood, but it's pretty much gone now. And that's because there were several generations, old people when I was young, and then people even my parents' age who were involved in making unusual, expressive, folky, for lack of a better word, kinds of things. And they were sometimes recognized in museum settings. There were sometimes major exhibitions. For example, a number of the Alberta folk artists were featured in the Alberta Pavilion in Expo 86 as kind of novelty, old, community, rural kinds of things, but still exciting. But it pretty much trailed off there then, because there weren't the next couple of generations of folk artists like there are here. Part of the reason for that was that there weren't groups like yours, there weren't events like the Folk Art Festival, there weren't people like Chris and Charlotte and others who helped the artists become the next generation or move into the next generation of creativity. So I'm going to show you things that you won't find anywhere in Alberta now because they've disappeared and they're not being made. They haven't been made for a half century or so. We also put together a collection of 100 or so prairie folk art that is the kind of thing that you think is folk art here, different themes and colors and characteristics and so forth. But we stopped collecting them because they stopped making it, whereas here you can continue appreciating and collecting and maybe even generating more value because there is this Nova Scotia support network that doesn't exist anywhere that I'm aware of on the prairies. So I brought along one piece that we actually brought with us. We gave about 100 of these to the Royal Alberta Museum when we left Edmonton. This I chose because it's one of my favorite, and as you can figure out, it's a cowboy late afternoon watering his horse at the well. My grandparents' ranch had these kinds of wells at it, so it speaks to me on that level. This was made by Martin Schatz, who was a retired cowhand, cowboy, small-scale rancher in southwestern Alberta in the Crow's Nest Pass. So with the winds there, he knew all about windmills. So he made a couple hundred of these kinds of objects, which were sort of creative documentations of square dances and bars full of cowboys and rodeo characters, bucking broncs and bulls and some fantasy animals. He also did multi-legged whirligigs of various, like kit foxes and coyotes and things like that. So he was really well known in that scene. But as I said, he was the last of his generation to be doing that. His daughter was a well-known folk musician, singer-songwriter, but nobody else in the family or the community continued on that sort of thing. Anyway, that was kind of a long segue into something else. So this is about the furniture made in ethnoculture and folk contexts on the prairies. My design background is, it's kind of a standing joke amongst designers, architects, and others that we do our best idea generation on napkins. So these are just napkin sketches of pieces of prairie furniture that I've seen or have collected or something. So it's just an intro. Essentially until the 1880s, most of the prairies was still indigenous territory. And the transition from indigenous to white or rural white or whatever took place quite quickly starting in 1885 after the Second Riel Rebellion. So in the 1880s, if you're traveling across the prairies, you would have seen a number of scenes like this, but a decade or more later, you would not. There would be no longer any nomadic indigenous life. And what happened within the decade or so after that, basically around 1900, the decade before and after 1900, was the start of a really big immigration rush. And this was based on the idea that the new Canadian regime in the West believed that this was all empty land and it had to be populated as fast as possible. And there were official policies that attracted all sorts of people onto the prairies. There were also really elaborate collusion arrangements between churches and the CPR and other governments to get as many people onto the prairies as possible. And the two logics were to create demand for the new railway services, and to put people onto the prairies who would continue to use the railways and all the commodification and import-export activity that started with the railways. Anyway, there was some really adventurous promotion to immigrants to the area around, within a couple of decades of 1900. Strathcona, this was actually an immigration brochure that was done in multiple languages and distributed around Europe, but it was trying to make the whole of the West really appealing. There was one of these kinds of promotions that was talking about frost-free winters, so that would be appealing to unsuspecting European immigrants. And as I mentioned, it was all, basically in a period of 20 or 30 years, what was buffalo land became railway land. So by 1910, there were thousands of kilometers of railway crisscrossing the provinces and territories that had all been built really quickly. So this is the oldest house in Old Strathcona. Strathcona was one of the early cities that made up Edmonton. This is the oldest standing house. It's only from 1891, but it's interesting because it's all manufactured components, and this was all coming in by rail from BC and other places. And this was the expectation of the the immigrants or the English-speaking immigrants. They were coming here to do this kind of thing, and they were able to shop. This is a couple blocks away from that house. This is our typical import retail of manufactured goods that was available at the time. So anybody who spoke English was already part of the national, even international consumer culture. So they could shop for these cataloged through general stores. They could get all of the commercial manufactured commodities they might be able to get in Toronto or Chicago or whatever. So that was to them part of the appeal of moving west. This map from the 20s, I think, shows all the areas of the Prairie provinces where there was a recognizable second language in practice. And there's some that we don't even know about now. I mean, Mormon apparently was a language, and Ruthenian nobody talks about anymore. And I think it says, let's see, somewhere, it includes Hebrew. But they were basically all of the unindustrialized, essentially peasant cultures that were still operating in mainly Eastern and Northern Europe, but also France to some extent, not so much Italy and Greece, but they all came either individually as settlers or in groups of settlers and plopped themselves down all over the prairies. Sometimes they had no choice where they were going, they were just assigned to locations. But that shows you kind of the ethnicity that occurred on the prairies around 1920. So this is a Ukrainian homestead. This is a photograph from the 1950s. The first building was the first house, maybe around 1900. The second one might have been 1920 or 30, probably 2 generations. The older one might have been converted to a barn or even a garage by that time. But this kind of architectural ethnicity occurred anywhere that there was farmland all over the prairies. But they varied according to those language maps that I showed you. So there were large concentrations of Mennonite complete villages in southern Manitoba. There were Doukhobor villages in east central Saskatchewan. There were Hutterite colonies all over the southern parts of the prairies. There were big Ukrainian blocks. Basically, the Ukrainian block stretched all the way from Edmonton to Saskatoon, and still does. This is a museum piece. The Ukrainian village near Edmonton has more than 100 of these buildings preserved and restored and well interpreted from the Ukrainian settlement period, again, 1892 to probably 1939, thereabouts. Part of this was also an assortment of decorative arts, particularly religious decorative arts. So this is the interior of one of the churches in that particular village. In the area east of Edmonton, basically from Edmonton to the Saskatchewan border, there are still about 120 Ukrainian churches, obviously visibly Ukrainian churches that are preserved or in use. Some of them you can still just walk into, and others are quite active in terms of weddings and anniversaries and things like that. But this was the kind of thing that they were familiar with. They hadn't gone through industrialization, so they're also capable and familiar with remaking this kind of thing after arriving on the prairies. So they didn't have to substitute their culture with new things, although they did that a couple generations later. So they came, and I don't have exact photos of some of these, but as I mentioned, there were complete villages, especially the Doukhobor villages east of Saskatoon, might have had a couple hundred people in them. And when you look at the photographs of that era, they are almost identical to the Doukhobor Russian villages that they left behind. So they literally picked up with nothing and relocated and rebuilt it all the way ahead, being in the old country. So here are a couple more examples. This is the Lars Jansson family from Sweden, and you can find exactly this building in Sweden still today. It was probably their first house and turned into a shed and storage afterwards. This is another one. This was somebody named Mr. Ulmer. I don't know anything about him except he must have been from the old district of Bavaria, and he would probably arrive there alone and probably spend his first summer, maybe his first winter, building this in order for his family to come. This is a Ruthenian barn, another one that's been restored, and this is another one of these things, except for a few more nails and maybe a bit more glass. This would have been the same building in that area of Ukraine or Poland. This is a Finnish sauna and sausage house. It was built as the first house, with the plan being that when the second house was built, this became the sauna. So it's been restored with the sauna inside, and it's got all that smoky black sooty stuff. And I don't think they're real sausages now, but you can imagine there could have been hundreds of links of sausages stored in this smoky building for the winter. So, what did they bring? Very little. This is a Doukhobor wheel. It might have been new when it left Russia, and it probably wasn't assembled, and it was probably a really valued object within the family, and it might have been the only thing that they carried with them, as they were moving by train and ship and train again to get from south central Russia to south central Saskatchewan or Alberta. But as I mentioned, for the most part, they were kind of skill independent of industrialized products. So although there's a little bit of iron in this, whether this was built in Russia, it came as an object, or it could have also been built in, well, especially in southern Saskatchewan or southern British Columbia, fairly soon after the arrival. And that was a common practice for all sorts of things: wagons, furniture, harness, tools, specialty tools. Most of the immigrant groups I'm talking about were capable of rebuilding looms, and for the first generation were making their own fabrics, or raising their own hemp and linen, and were pretty much self-sufficient. They did bring some things. This is a Russian Mennonite chest, and this would have been a traveler's effect, but this probably would have been for an extended family. Like there might have been several men and women and maybe some children who were able to bring this with them, partly because they had to be able to carry it. However, these were made in Russia. They were made in the early settlement period in the Mennonite territories of Manitoba, and then they were made in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And on the Alberta Hutterite colonies, they were made until maybe the 1960s or 70s, and you could tell by the color and some of the hardware details approximately when they were from. Now you can still see these once in a while in antique malls, but some people wouldn't know what they are. Most people wouldn't know what they are. And they're really characteristic. The big brass knobs on the top were part of the hardware, but they provided kind of a ceremonial protection for the top of it. The handles were always super rugged. Sometimes they had quite elaborate escutcheon plates on the lock sets, and sometimes they were generalized, or sort of not generalized, they were kind of abstracted. Two horse dragon heads that were related to the imperial iconography of the Russian. This is another Mennonite one. So benches like this were a classic for with all the religious groups, as well as some of the ethnic groups. And it's a little hard to tell them apart sometimes, because the Mennonites and Hutterites were all ethnic, even though they were coming from further east in Europe. But they sometimes the Hutterite, Mennonite, and particularly the Hutterite and Mennonite pieces, they looked interchangeable, and sometimes they're actually made interchangeably. So it was just quite fine for a Hutterite colony with a woodworking shop to make Hutterite Germanic things that, when they were painted the right color, would appeal to the Hutterite Germanic barter customers. So it's kind of a mess in terms of identifying some of these, and sometimes the only way you can tell is by knowing where they came from. But this bench form was really common. Every immigrant house has something like this. This one is Ukrainian. They also had some typical forms for cabinet furniture. And they were pretty much all knocked out, early flat pack. You can take this apart with about a half a dozen bolts and really pack it. That wasn't to get them here, that was just the tradition of making that way. And I think that tradition or that practice might actually go back to the Middle Ages, when it was quite common for the aristocracy to move from one estate or castle to another location. They would take all their valuables with them. Hence the German word, or German and Scandinavian and other countries use some variation on the word mobler, movable, for all of the possessions that were traditionally moved from one place to another. So they still ended up on the prairies, looking kind of, I don't know, primitive Baroque in some cases, but they still had this sort of functional, ceremonial, but still knocked down kind of character. This one's Ukrainian. The Ukrainians were a little bit more colorful and flamboyant in what they did, but they weren't always as skilled, and I suspect that they were just more interested in being colorful and flamboyant than they were in being really skilled. I'm not sure how that relates to the popularity of Ukrainian dance and Ukrainian food, for example, which is always voluminous and loud and boisterous and fun. It could also be that in places like the Hutterite and the Doukhobor settlements, there were professional makers of these sorts of things. And speaking of Doukhobors, this is one of the most Doukhobor furniture forms from the prairies. These kind of squat, squarish tables. This one has, they were usually either turned legs or rails at the bottom, or a drawer, or scalloped aprons. They always had a scrub top that was removable, that was done with a long keyed tenon that holds the whole top together. I actually have one here, and it expands in width by half an inch on a seasonal basis, so that's the reason for getting the key underneath. But you see this anywhere in the prairies, and unless somebody's lying to you, it's very likely that it's of Doukhobor origin, even if they don't know. Here's another variation on this one. This doesn't have the bottom rails, but it has a really elaborate scalloping. And it's hard to say that these were just purposeful, because they were used in churches, they were used for ceremonial events. If there was like a family event somewhere, this kind of table was always brought out, almost used in altar fashion. In fact, I've noticed an example of this in use. I think it's at one of the Doukhobor museums where it's been redisplayed. And it had almost the same arrangement of food things, sort of ceremonial foods on this little table, as you see I've seen with the Buddhist Korean ceremonies where food for the ancestors is laid out. So maybe this is something essentially human, that you have this or old human, that you have this ceremonial thing where you have some ceremonial food for a ceremonial event. Maybe we do with Christmas cakes or something now, or birthday cakes, I don't know. But anyway, my point was that you would not necessarily be cooking and eating off this, but a Doukhobor house would have one of these for some array of ceremonial things. This is another Mennonite cabinet. Sorry, you really can't see very much of it. One of the other Mennonite features were these corner cupboards, and they usually had a matching shelf that they sat on, so they would be up at the wainscot level in a traditional house. And I don't have any photographs of the house interiors, although I do. The Mennonite Museum in Steinbeck, Manitoba has 20 or 30 original Mennonite buildings, including house barn combinations and other things that they've preserved there really well. And this is a relatively recent one because it's got this dark stain on it, which was part of the transition of becoming North America. Earlier versions of these were usually painted as brightly as they could be, and the most common of them are bright yellow with black trim. Speaking of, this is a Mennonite, this is a Schwaffbank. This is also typical of these Central European immigrant groups, not just the Germanic. So the thing about this is that it's got 4 legs on the front. The front pulls out. It has, let me say this again, it has 2 sides that slide past each other. The whole front comes out. It's basically 2 boxes, 2 incomplete boxes that slide inside each other. So it doubles the space there. And this was adult bed accommodation in a small house. And then later on, it might have been used in a more formal room, maybe for guests, and then the transition, maybe another decade or so after that, would be if we moved out onto the porch, and then the next transition was that it was moved out to the woodshed, and the next transition beyond that was the firewood pile. And I'll show you an example of that. But this is absolutely classic. Oh, I guess there's some interesting analysis opportunities. So the slight ogee on the leg, on the upper arm, and the scalloping on the back come from the Biedermeier neoclassical period of the roughly 1820s in more formal Germanic furniture. So somebody maybe was a servant in a larger, more formal house, saw this and started making them, but it became a generic pattern for all of the furniture makers. So I'm not sure how you compare this. This is kind of like, you know how the Chippendale pattern books of the 1780s or whatever swept around basically the industrialized world, and you can get Chippendale chairs and Chippendale settees and things made in Philadelphia or Edinburgh or rural Toronto, Ontario. I think this was kind of one of those things that was about as typically as Germanic as you could get. This is probably the most exotic of those things that I'm showing in this little collection. I don't know, it's kind of country Baroque with color and graining and turnings. You can see some interesting portraits on either side. This was some master maker's tour de force. It might have been the only one he made on the prairies because there might not have been enough desire for more of these, although there are instances with the Ukrainian furniture makers that the research at places like the Museum of Civilization in Gatineau has been able to determine that they know where there are 5 pieces that were made by the same person, but they were all varied in color and in detail. This is kind of the segue into the next little bit. In much the same way that pickers and dealers swept through Nova Scotia and other Atlantic areas, especially in the 80s and 90s, the same thing happened in the prairies. And this is an American magazine that shows you how to collect and decorate with Saskatchewan antiques, all of which I'm sure would have been in the US by the time they were photographed in this magazine. So a very large portion of this left. And there are a few museums. I've already mentioned the Ukrainian village and the Mennonite village at Steinbeck in Manitoba. There's several others that have big collections of this stuff. But that's basically all you find it. There might still be older collectors, kind of like us actually, who remember the rush of this and still have these things. But in terms of new institutional interest, I just don't think there is. I think the furniture is gone, and I think the interest in the furniture is pretty much gone. The young academics are far more interested in something else. This is a little cluster of things that I acquired over the years, and these are now at the Royal Alberta Museum. So this is a sauna stool. It actually came out of a ruin of a sauna building west of Edmonton in the foothills and forested areas of the foothills. And it's just about as crude as you could get. You can imagine somebody whipping it together in an hour or so. But it did survive 75 years before I actually found it. So somebody must have thought that there was some value aside from just in firewood. I don't really know how it survived, and who knows how many of them didn't survive. But this kind of stuff was all over the place. Even with my grandparents' cattle ranch, they would make new milking stools every year just because they would wear out. You put them or toss them on a junk pile somewhere. So there was an ephemeralness of these kinds of things. So the fact that one of them has survived is probably unusual. This is another example. I happen to know this was a Mennonite piece because I bought it out of a Mennonite farm sale for $1. You would know otherwise. It's just kind of fascinatingly crude. And I really like the wear on it. I like everything that's wrong with it from a fine furniture perspective. But there were also things that I found. This is a Mennonite, I'm not sure what you'd call it, a potty stand. Metal pail would go underneath, and there's tacks that showed that it likely, for at least some of its life, had fabric tacked underneath it to conceal the pail. But when you live in a one or two room house in rural Alberta or Saskatchewan, where the temperature drops to -40 and the wind can be howling at 50 clicks or even 50 miles an hour, you really like this kind of thing in your house. The ceremonial value to not having to go out to the outhouse would have been so important. So what would you do except doll it up, turn it into something fun and delightful, scallop the edges, paint it up, fix it a couple of times, maybe change the fabric when you got, tatty. This is appealing to me because of the folk tendency to celebrate the mundane, or almost to celebrate anything. If there's a surface there, it needs to be decorated. If there's a piece of structure, it needs to be scalloped and painted. Here are a couple of other examples. Now, this is where it's a little bit more functional in its purpose, because these are Hutterite pieces. This little stool in the front is absolutely medieval in its origin. It's a single plank for the top. It's got 2 more keyed pieces underneath, and it's got 4 legs. So there's 7 pieces. It's just wedged together, and it would have been really easy to take it apart. And these were made on several of the Hutterite colonies, and they were probably made as a Hutterite export. I don't know if they necessarily sold off the colony, but they could have been traded for corn or basket materials or something else to other colonies. So these are quite common, or were quite common. I'm not sure that they are now. And then behind is another really typically Hutterite piece. This was about 12 feet long in its original configuration. It had 3 legs. And that's because Hutterite colonies still dined communally. You have long communal tables with long communal benches, and there were always combinations of benches and tables. They were, early on, they were painted these kinds of bright colors because color was sort of, in a way, it was functional, but it wasn't sinfully decorative in an old Orthodox setting. Then there was a religious revival in the 50s and 60s where a lot of this older stuff had all its paint stripped off and was given really glossy clear coats. So if you find some of these things that are just shiny varnished fur, you know that they were older and that they had gone through that religious revival that took all the color off them. Another one of my favorites, this is about as classic a Mennonite table as you'd find on the prairies, but it's also something that you would see that came out of the Lono district of Ontario. It would have made regularly in all the Pennsylvania, Dutch areas. And it's a little bit related to some of the things that were done here. There's a Sheridan influence, but I'm not sure that they were aware of that. This was a table that came in a whole variety of sizes. The scalloping of the bracket, the OG bracket, was one of the features. You can see the keyed spline that holds the top on. Sometimes they were treated a little bit differently, and sometimes they were painted in multiple colors. But this is also, for me at least, if I was roaming around rural Alberta and I saw something like that, I would know immediately that it was a Mennonite table. And this is how they varied. Sometimes they had a horizontal bead applied. This darker one here, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but the darker one, it's actually burgundy with it, which you can't really see here. From the bottom rail down, the legs had been sponged with a bright yellow paint. And I didn't put that back on in the restoration, but I think the yellow was probably sponged on afterwards to cover up the wear that had occurred around the leg. So it was a bit of a debate for me as to whether to put that element of the color back on. Anyway, so this is kind of the height of these things amongst the Mennonite settlements, homesteads. The table, you can see the table better. This diamond shape shows up in lots of Mennonite features. Hooked rugs, woven pieces. I don't know the origin of that. It might have another Badermeyer thing. It was probably an inlay lozenge in a more formal, older piece of furniture. I don't have a photograph of this, but I also have a smaller bench where the apron on the bench has got 3 of those triangles cut into it as the ornamental treatment. By the way, this is all junk wood. This is crepe wood, spruce. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the local woods that we used. And another one of the Schlafbeck things has got the same pull-out, the same OG arms, the simplified triangular top that comes from neoclassicism. And I really regret the fact that I left these at the museum to bring them with me because I love this stuff so much. Anyway, let's take a share this way. In most of the area of Ukraine that was forested, poplar was a viable hardwood. It was used for furniture, tools, plow handles, other things, probably weapons as well. So the settlers who came from those areas were familiar with the tree, but what they didn't know when they arrived in Saskatchewan and Alberta was that the poplar was a fast-growing, really soft wood that wasn't very durable, but it was easy to work. So this is somebody who knew how to make this chair in Ukraine, and set out to make one or maybe many of them, several or even a batch of them, probably in east central Alberta, without knowing the different characteristics of the poplar there in Ukraine and the poplar there in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So it failed as a chair. It appears as though it started falling apart fairly soon after it was made, and it was repaired at least 3 times and repainted at least twice. So this is probably happening around 1920. Why would anybody keep this long enough for me to find it and get it into a museum? I think the memory aspect of this, the cultural residual characteristics of these things meant that it was important, and maybe it was literally enough that an older man made this, but he wanted his children and grandchildren to know something about this tradition. So he kept this failed chair, and he could still tell the story about a furniture maker. And I'm just making this all up, so it could be bullshit. But it seems like there was more value to that maker and that maker's descendants, we would hope maybe, or maybe just didn't get tossed on the firewood pile. Anyway, I think it embodies way more than a crappy old piece of furniture, particularly because of the color and a little bit of sculpting.
It has no bar at the back.
Well, it might have had one because there's a sign of a hole actually at the front as well. I'm not sure whether that disappeared in one of the modifications.
Okay.
I put enough glue into this that it wouldn't collapse if somebody was to use it, but I didn't let anybody sit on it. It would not be safe now either, so another part of its history. Although the first generation of makers, women with textiles, men with woods, sounds a little stereotypical, but they did tend to work in and out of homes and workshops and things. They were capable of this, or really capable of doing this, and they did some really marvelous stuff. But then the next generation was a little embarrassed by it. The next generation may have wanted to get something out of the Eaton's catalog instead, and then the next generation after that would have wanted to get rid of that stuff and replace it with chrome furniture with vinyl upholstery. And the next generation after that might want to get rid of it all because they were moving in a mobile home. So the transitions, there were various details around that. In some cases, the actual makers destroyed these things within a relatively early period of time, but more often it was subsequent families. So this is a Dukeover piece from East Central Saskatchewan from late 1890s. So first generation maker, first generation product in one of the communal Russian style villages. His name was Michael Vazarov. It's really unusual to find that information. This is half restored because I found it in pieces and it literally was on a burn pile. And it's got the classic features, the rails, the upper rails, the lower rails, the missing drawer, the scrub top, the keyed splines, the turnings. And after doing some microscopic, a lot of reconstructive surgery on it, there were broken tendons and missing pegs and things like that. And then the color research produced this. This is another one of those things where you might wonder why, when people have arrived into these really, really rough, hard survival settings in the wet Canadian West, viciously hot summers, wickedly cold summers, mosquitoes all year, nowhere to go except the closest railway station, and probably not living in the same degree of comfort as you might have had even as a peasant in some old country setting. But there was still this compulsion to make stuff like this. And even if it took half the chicken coop and all winter to make something like this, it was really, really important as a cultural survival and as a personal expression thing, to do these kinds of things. So, sort of ta-da to them for having managed crossing an ocean and traveling thousands of kilometers in smoky drains in order to get here, and then still want to do this kind of stuff. It wasn't all as sort of ethnically flamboyant or distinctive. I found this on a farm auction of a Central European name, but I don't know who they were ethnically. It's still got some of the Germanic influences, but it could also just be an ordinary 1920s homemade kitchen cabinet. But it was in some of the paint restoration, and I found this original color on it. There were some other things that were really essential prairie pieces, but they weren't necessarily ethnic pieces. So canning and preserving was really important for the survival in the prairie. So you picked all the raspberries and chokeberries and Saskatoons that you possibly could, and grew as much rhubarb and everything else as you could. So it was always necessary to have a cabinet in the kitchen or somewhere close to the kitchen or in the cellar of a homestead house where you could keep this stuff, you could keep track of it, make sure the children weren't eating it in the dark. But there was also a bit of celebration of displaying this kind of stuff. Because when you'd spent the last month of the summer getting all of this stuff preserved for the winter, you just needed to celebrate it somehow. So a pretty piece of fabric and a rough but painted up cabinet would just help to demonstrate that you were surviving and doing well, especially when there were probably no Cossacks attacking the village. They did get bigger. This was a German or Mennonite piece made on the prairies, probably for a second home just because of the size of it. And this was another one of those things where nobody knew what it was. The cornice is a replacement. The pie shelf is a replacement. Some of the pieces had been covered with linoleum in the 1950s, which was kind of cool, but not very to this piece. So this took a lot of restoration as well. But I don't know much about this one except that it had all the characteristics of not being from the Eames catalog. The gender spread of this making was probably, well, there was more gender spread to the making activity than we might think now. So, I mean, men were as involved in producing food as women were involved in making things for the house. And there were professional weavers in Doukhobor villages as well as in some of the Ukrainian settlers who were men. But there were also women who were just doing other things. They don't tend to be reported very well, but there was a Ukrainian potter in Saskatchewan around 1900, and he had a couple of women working for him, but nobody knows their names. Funny thing. These are domestic pieces of Hutterite origin. The Hutterites dined communally, so every table would have had a spooner like this in it, and there were spoons in it. The spoons in this case were manufactured, sometimes they were handmade, and they were personalized by tapping initials into them, but they were decorative initials, kind of like you see in fracture and needlework. So each one of those has a name to indicate whose it was, and we would pull their spoon up in order to have the next meal. The other thing is a masher, and it's kind of ordinary. You can find that in lots of other places, except that it was the Hutterites who always had this really shiny surface on it. It's kind of like they liked these shiny surfaces, kind of like we would prefer plastic over maybe raw wood or something in some instances. But it was their kind of Christian cleanliness, I guess, that was driving them to use these kinds of surfaces. So they're recognizable. These are all Hutterite pieces too. Coat rack, shelf, comb shelf. In the older Hutterite colonies, a mirror would have been considered too vain or encouraging vanity. But you had to look at a mirror, women had to look at a mirror in order to get their hair braided properly before they went to town. And I'll show you something in a minute. But so that held hair ribbons, not ribbons, hair ropes, little ropes, and a comb, and a couple of other things that were part of being pious looking rather than being fashionable or vain. Kind of hard to explain. I had another one of these that was almost the same shape, except it was much more recent. It was made of recycled cardboard, and it had images from 1950s vintage magazines collaged all over it. But it was contemporary women's fashion, it was modern lighting, it was things like commercial hems, all these kind of slightly forbidden, by Hutterite standards, these slightly forbidden things, that they had been collaged onto this mirror frame. Who knows what that was all about. But, so the other thing, a couple of other things that are interesting here, they did vast quantities of baskets. Many of the Hutterite colonies had whole fields of willow that they grew and maintained. And they made baskets of all sorts of different shapes and uses. and they are sometimes most distinguished because they have some variation of color on them. This one's painted. Other times they were left in the raw willow for one color, and they were used in the peel willow for another. And then there were some of them that were dyed probably because you could buy red dyes down at the general store. So there was a whole other material culture about basket making, which is also gone. I think the last of them might have been done in the 60s or the 70s out here. The hair strips I was talking about, there's one, and they were used for tying up the hair under usually a black scarf. So one of those metal pieces, sort of like a two-pronged end on it, that's used for making those things. And the other one is a tool that's especially for stripping and bending the willow for basket making. So, there's a chance that those are the only two that are in an Alberta museum now, because probably not very many people would know what these are. Little boxes were really important because personal possessions had to be small, otherwise they were also part of a communal structure. But everybody had some little box, and sometimes an older box would look older, like this one with the initials on it. But there, I wanted to show Adrian there. There are the tulips and the German tulips, the German roses, and there are going to be some bluebirds show up in a minute. But then the more recent ones were these other two on the right, which are part plywood. And that was a curious transition after the Second World War. The Hutterites liked plywood so much that they decided that it was an exciting new material. So they made all of these, continued making all of these older forms, but they delighted in adding plywood into them for tabletops and door robins and things like that. So they weren't being orthodox about their materials and processes, although they were still being orthodox about what some of these things had to be and what they had to look like. Again, I think most of these would not be found anywhere in colonies now, even as old ones. The one transition that has occurred is that a number of the big colonies have got very active commercial cabinet making shops. So they have a kind of rural trades in kitchen kits and complete kitchens, and they do contract work. There was one of them that had a big contract for one of the hospitals to do all the case goods in the hospital. So they still do this, it just doesn't have any initials and tulips on it anymore. Here are a couple of these are breathing handkerchiefs. These were typically done between, young women for young men, or sometimes married couples, and they were celebratory. And this is another one of these conundrum things where they weren't supposed to be very decorative, but as long as the decorative was purposeful in that you could include names and dates and other things in it, then it was, you're welcome to do it. It just can't be fancy. And these were all over the place. A lot of them are undocumented. I've actually seen, they're more of the birds. They're not bluebirds, I guess they're redbirds. They're the bluebirds. And they were quite common for a while in the rural antique shops. They were often bartered. I don't have a photo, but I got a couple of rag rugs that were made on a Hutterite colony, and they traded them to a non-Hutterite woman who had them at a farmer's market, and she told me that the money that I paid for them, she was going to take to the co-op store and buy an electric frying pan to take back to her Hutterite friend who had made these things, because the Hutterite friend should not have a cash income, but a gift of a frying pan was just fine within the orthodoxy. Anyway, I've seen, because of this kind of curious orthodoxy and some of the secrecy about it, there were quite often things like this where the names would be taken out as though you could no longer read them. Of course, you could see it in the fabric, but they were basically destroyed in order to maintain the anonymity when they came off the colony and went into an auction sale or a picker or a dealer. One of these. This is a Ukrainian votive box. This is also a uniquely Ukrainian thing in both the Eastern and Western rites, but they had different purposes, but they were the same thing. So this always sat on the east wall of the house. The east room of the house was the more formal room. And this sat on the east wall of that room, and it frequently had a woven geometric pattern tapestry hanging above it, and there was often a bench hanging there, sitting below it. It might have even been one of the Schlafbanks or the Bombettels that I showed you. The Ukrainian was Bombettel, Schlafbank was German. But this was for, depending on who you were, it has some religious objects in it, maybe a crucifix, candles, a couple of other things like that. But then I also had people tell me that that's where the valuables were kept. So the title to the land and the manual for the tractor would be kept in one of these boxes along with whatever religious stuff is still there. One of the last of the material processes that survived in Ukrainian land. So you've probably heard that Ukrainian dance is a huge thing and it survives spectacularly. So have some crafts such as peasant drawing, so have lots of the traditional foods, but this kind of thing hasn't. When after the wall, East European wall came down, there were a lot of master crafts people from Alberta and Saskatchewan who went back to some of the institutions in Ukraine to reteach things like dance. So Shumka had a number of expert dancers go back to teach the Ukrainians dance, because before that they had been being taught Russian dance. Of course, they were Russians. They did the same thing with Ukrainian egg drawing, and they did the same with some of the weavers. So this was one of the weavers who was a second generation in Alberta who was still weaving rushnak. It's a sort of ceremonial scarf, which can be used for multiple things. She was weaving them and not able to sell them at farmers markets because people thought they were too ethnic. But she was one of the people who went back to one of the big museums in Ukraine to teach this weaving technique for a period of time. So I managed to get one of these from her and tell that story now. This is a Doukhobor mat, probably from the 1950s, and it's really characteristically Doukhobor. It's not just a little woven thing. None of these would be being made now. This looks like an ordinary rag rug, but there were two sisters who were third generation Norwegian descent in East Central Alberta, and they both made rugs, but the other sister had inherited the Norwegian style loom, which she was using in the third generation of the loom. It had been built in Alberta, but she was the third generation user. But she wouldn't share the loom with her sister, so the sister had to make rag rugs. So in the sister's mind, these were Norwegian as well. So you can't really argue with them when they heard a story like that. But again, that's the kind of stuff that 20, 30 years ago, you could find new at farmers markets, but would not show up anywhere now. And you can make the same, general comments about the kind of the disappearance of the individuality and the sort of the social character of quilt making. This happens to be one of my grandmothers and one of her quilt circle made around the time of the Second World War, so they would have been quilting for hospitals as well. But by now, any of the quilters who are still doing anything like that individually or in a social group are choosing to buy all new fabrics. They're choosing to buy published patterns, and in the competitions, they will then rate each other on how fine their stitching is rather than how many quilts that they can make for the Red Cross. So all of that kind of stuff has pretty much disappeared too. So even when you hear people in the prairie say, oh, I'm a quilt maker, I'm a traditional quilter, they're probably making something that's out of a pattern book that they've been told is a traditional quilt pattern has probably been designed in Chicago, or materials might be coming from China. So the actualness, in my mind, has disappeared from most of those kinds of things. Final of this series, this is another example of the sort of the, I don't know if you want to call it deterioration or decline, or the emerging of new influencers or something. This is probably mid-1920s. It's handmade, scrap wood of Ukrainian origin. It's all elaborately grained. It's got yellow and dark brown varnish on it as the finish. I had to replace the hooks because somebody had taken them off, probably used them somewhere else. But this is an exact copy of a piece of furniture that you could order from the Eaton's catalog, which is why I think it's about mid-20s. So this was somebody who was still making furniture but didn't have enough of an economic opportunity to buy from the Eaton's catalog, but they were so keen to have something that looked like it came from the Eaton's catalog, they would just do a pretty good fake. And this is sort of a continuation of this lost story. don't want to belabor it, but in all of my research, I talked to lots of people who remembered something from their parents or grandparents' generation, and then they say, "Oh yeah, no, we burned Bob's house along with all the furniture because we wanted to expand the field." And one particularly poignant example of that was a good friend who was third or fourth generation of Ukrainian descent, and they still talk about that. It's not that it would be a kind of a point of pride that they think that their baba makes better pierogies than anybody else. They never are that good, but they always think that. Anyway, this one friend, when we had in the collection, there's about a 4-foot long log old piece of copper carved into a half shell with finished ends. And it would have been, many of these homesteads would have had multiples of them in different sizes, all made right there. So my friend saw this, and she said, "Oh, that's just like Baba's." But when Baba went into the home, they cleaned out all the ruffled stuff of Baba's house. And one of them was these bowls. There were several bowls, but one in particular. And one of these bowls, Baba had in her mind the complete recipe for making pierogi or paraka. And she knew that much of it was flour, that much of it was potatoes, there needed to be 6 eggs, and there was something else that she would put in it. And that was her recipe was based on the bowl. So as soon as the family destroyed the bowl, Baba couldn't recreate the pierogi recipe, and they haven't made them since. They bought them from Chimo pierogies frozen instead. So there was it's kind of, I mean, I sort of belabored the sadness of some of these things, but they flourished. They were exciting for some people, and then they became not exciting for a lot of people. And now it's pretty much museum fare if somebody was watching for it. So, why am I interested in this old shed? My background is in design and design history, and way back, my thesis project was to take some of this folk furniture as a design source and develop it into a manufactured flat pack furniture system. So the idea was you could digitally cut and finish these things, and they would come IKEA or whatever, and you could assemble them, but they wouldn't be white melamine furniture. They would be something that had some visual reference to folk culture. So I was sort of imagining what contemporary folk furniture would be if it was similar to how folk musicians have mined hundreds of years of musical history and period instruments and all sorts of other things, and develop them into new activity. So that was the premise of this. And this is a series, well, you can see how long ago that was. That is me. That's this is a part of that series of things that I was testing as a new consumer product based on some aspect of original character and do it yourself. And then with some of these ethnocultural influences. This is some of my studio work from a little bit more recent, taking old period pieces, usually ethnic pieces, and developing them into something new. This happens to be in waxed ash and dyed MDF. No self-respecting furniture maker ever uses MDF, but I like the idea that I would. This is another piece that's more literally based. It's a cabinet, about a 7-foot high cabinet based on some of the slightly reduced, slightly simplified, modernized versions of some of the big Ukrainian and Mennonite pieces that I was discovering around the prairies. So there we are, full circle. It's another napkin sketch of crazy old furniture.
Does anyone have any questions for Tom or any comments or statements? Yes. Here, Tom.
I'm just curious about the paint. The availability of paint to early painters of furniture in out west. What was it, and how did they get it? Because the colors are incredible.
Yeah. There would have been people who were capable of making their own paints. I mean, that was common up until the Second World War in some settings. So that's a possibility. But I think the brightness of these was also because you might be able to buy, I didn't mention it. In fact, it was the pair of it was the Schlafbank and the Mennonite table that were the same color in the green bowl. That color is exactly the corporate color of CPR Railway. So that color could have been left over from painting a railway station, or it could have been stolen off the platform of the railway station. So I think most of the colorful stuff, more than half of the colorful stuff, was commercial paints that were coming available then, which meant they were glossier and really, really bright pigments. Fun stuff.
So they would have been available for retail, or?
Yeah. Well, maybe I made the makers of these sound really isolated. They weren't actually, because part of the railway construction policy of the prairies is that every homestead should be within 7 miles of a railway station.
Okay.
So, and that was the distance that you could take a wagon or sleigh of grain to town and back to deliver. That was the logic. And there still are. I mean, there are lots of these railway strips where the rails are gone and the buildings are gone, but there's still highway signs. And sometimes the highway signs for these places were placed alphabetically, so you could see A, B, C, D as you're going down. So they were not that isolated in that they could relatively easily, pick a can of paint somewhere or share cans of paint around the neighborhood. So it wasn't a rare thing.
Great, thank you.
You mentioned Ukrainian a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any historic reason why Ukrainians?
Oh yeah. Well, there were two. In the late 19th century, the Ukrainians were under a lot of pressure from Russia, as they had been many times before and since. So there was a large refugee element then. Then the Hutterites, Mennonites, Doukhobors scattered through areas of eastern Germany and Russia. The boundaries have all changed now, so it's hard to be specific. They were all, if you go back another century from then to the period of Catherine the Great, Russia was moving into this, what's now southern Russia, which was the open grasslands. And it was relatively unpopulated in the mid to late 18th century. So these, the pacifist Christian groups, such as the Mennonites, Hutterites, Doukhobors, or others, were attracted in large numbers by the administration of Catherine the Great, generally, to southern Russia to populate that area. So they were pioneer settlers there, and then they became pioneer settlers in Western Canada another century and a half later. So by the time of the late 19th century, when they started moving here, there was quite a bit of overpopulation. Whenever they were successful farmers, their families got too big, so there was a shortage of land in various places. And the Canadian government hooked into this idea, along with the CPR and steamship lines and others, that they could attract a lot of these people, especially in groups, to Western Canada as a large settlement force. So in the case of the Ukrainians, there were several prominent Ukrainian leaders who were brought to Canada by the government and CPR arrangements. They were toured through Western Canada in really nice summer weather, and they were sent back to Ukrainian villages to recruit young people who sometimes a whole generation would leave one village, and they would be moved to Saskatchewan or Alberta. Earlier it was the Mennonites coming to southern Saskatchewan, Manitoba. The Mennonites came in several waves starting in the 1870s actually for the first one. So they were religious refugees who happened to fit into the settlement schemes of the Canadian government and a number of Canadian corporations in order to populate Western Canada for two reasons. One was to permanently displace the nomadic indigenous cultures, and the other was to establish a non-American presence in Western Canada, because the Americans were always looking across the border to expand as far as Alaska. So if you could get a whole bunch of people who were indebted to the Canadian government living on the prairies, it was going to be easier to keep the American influence off the prairies. So it's a pretty complicated bunch of details in there. The consequence, though, I don't know if I actually mentioned it, there were about 400,000 square kilometers of land that were open for settlement from 1885 on until the Second World War. And of the 100,000 immigrants who came in a shorter period of time, at least a quarter of them, nobody knows for sure, but at least a quarter of them, so at least, that would be the dates, maybe 1900 to 1910 or so. A quarter of them were not English speaking, and they were coming from these old, overpopulated, sometimes religiously repressed areas. So that's why that map I showed you included things like Hebrews. And Hebrews is, that's what it says, Negroes as sort of linguistic or cultural groups. But in the case of the African Americans, they were coming out of sort of desperate circumstances in the Old South, and they were being given land, sometimes in villages. There was one north of Edmonton that was quite famous, and it was called Carrot Creek. And there were a couple hundred families from Alabama, that area, who were settled there with this government involvement. So about a third of the settlement was people from U.S., Canada, England, well, all of the British Isles, or the United Kingdom and Ireland. Big Anglosphere. So about a third of them were people who came from that. Probably at least half of the total would have been from eastern U.S. and eastern Canada, moving west. And they didn't have the ethnic connections, they just had the mobility, and they were already in the consumer world. So they moved west and they bought farm equipment, and they sent their ship. They shipped their grain back to Toronto or wherever it was going to Lakehead. But it was this minimum 50,000 people who came out of these more or less refugee settings in, well, also Northern Europe. I didn't mention the Scandinavians very much. There were Poles, there were definitely Scandinavians all the way through this. So there are areas in, like in Alberta, which I know better, there are places like New Norway and Little Denmark and Valhalla and several others that have got these Scandinavian names, and that was part of their ethnic celebration, even just in naming the places that they had come to. And those are still, there are a whole bunch of ethnocultural museums. There's a Danish-Canadian museum near Red Deer, and there's a Norwegian loft house in the area, which is a reconstruction of basically a 18th or 19th century Norwegian farmhouse. So there's still elements of this there. It's just that I don't know of anybody who's making furniture in that context.
Tom, near Prince Albert, there's quite a few Scandinavians that came up from Minnesota and traveled up to northern Saskatchewan. Yeah. And there's whole areas in there that's all Scandinavian.
Mm-hmm. My grandmother was like that. She came to North Dakota first, and then married a Canadian there and moved up to Alberta. That's the second generation immigration. So they often came as they were young, and then, well, in the case of my family, my grandparents had 7 children, and in North Dakota, where they had settled 20 or 30 years before, there was no longer enough land for them to expand into farming. So they just packed up. They had 3 train cars full of stuff that they had moved to southeastern Alberta. And within a decade, they had 500 head of cattle by relocating. So there was lots of really good opportunity for people who had the wherewithal. So it shouldn't make it sound like they were all destitute. It's just that the more Central European or the more Northern European, the less related to the Anglosphere, the more likely they were to be poor and pre-industrial.
Not a question, just thanks very much, because I just thought it was very informative to see how people incorporated all these functional items in their houses, making them look good and also be a reminder of where they came from.
There are historic photographs, rare historic photographs of these places where you can see an entire Lunenburg village, or you can see the interior of a Ukrainian or a Mennonite home. And that's where you realize it really was not living in North America in terms of what they had there. By the time they were prosperous enough, they might buy a crane separator because they were able to afford a number of cows, but they were still making their cream butter or cheese in these things that were made like they were in Russia or Germany or Sweden. So yeah, that's I think a really we couldn't understand it. I mean, if we were to pack up and go somewhere, we would downsize. We may take some favorite things, but we wouldn't reconstruct our life in a new location as we left it in the old location.
Another interesting thing, in my family, which is go back to the prairies in the 1910s and 20s and earlier, we had some of those pieces, but we weren't Mennonite or Hutterite, so we used them for different things. Say that stand, that table was a wash table.
Mm-hmm.
The basin, because there was no running water, would sit on that. It wasn't sacred or in any way.
Yeah, and then later on, probably in the 50s or later, they might have been converted to a little sink, and there would be a cold water tap there. Yeah, that would be the transition.
That wasn't until the 80s.
Oh, the 80s. Okay. You can't always rush into new things, can you? Yeah, there would have been other crossovers like that, and I guess that's where. And I mean, I simplified a lot of this just to make it an interesting enough story. I guess maybe the biggest theme to all of this was the adaptive nature of everybody who showed up out there in the prairies. It just had.
Interesting, thank you.
Tom, on behalf of the people here, a sincere thanks for your talk. I mean, you've really brought these simple pieces of furniture to life, and it is your sort of expertise that has been able to sort of sift into this material, and I think it's really, really important.
Oh, thanks. It's a nice opportunity, actually, because I haven't even thought about this since I was up there in the years ago. It's a great excuse. Thank you.
And also, I'd like to add, as you've given the talk, you do get a free membership for life from the